Is the Switch 2 taking on the PS5? Sony isn't done improving the PS5, and Sony's latest move is good for them and bad for us. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. This is the early week update. I hope you had a great long Labor Day weekend full of hanging out outside for the end of summer and, of course, a ton of gaming. I know a bunch of people are playing Armored Core 6 on the PlayStation 5 right now, but if you've never heard of Blasphemous before, you should check that game out and then check out the new sequel. The sequel is great because it doesn't really re-revolutionize the game, so if you play through the first game, you can jump to the second one and it's just the same thing, but more, and I mean that in the best way. So if you need a recommendation of like a $25-$30 game that you can blow through in a weekend, I highly recommend checking out Blasphemous 2. So the first story I want to talk about today is the situation surrounding the Switch 2 versus the PlayStation 5, because allegedly, according to a verified leaker who's pretty good, I guess, I mean, take all of this with a grain of salt, the Switch 2 dev kits have been out for quite a little while now, and it's targeting PS5 performance. But obviously there's going to be a lot of technicalities and caveats there. I'll explain those in a minute, but the launch title that they're working to have on the Switch 2 is Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is pretty notable because Sony has been paying a ton of money lately to keep that off of Xbox. Now, the reason I think that could eventually come to the Switch is because Sony is probably sitting there like, well, we're going to give Square Enix a ton of money to keep this game exclusive, but we shouldn't really have to pay them to keep it off the Switch because it probably wouldn't run at all on the Switch. I know the Switch is a pretty capable machine, but even going back to the last Final Fantasy game before Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy 15, there were some efforts to get that running on the Switch, and what they eventually ended up doing was making a mobile version of Final Fantasy 15 that had little chibi characters. It reminded me of the DS version of Final Fantasy 4 back in the day, if you ever played that, where they remade it in 3D. It removed a lot of the open world elements, it kind of streamlined the combat, and if you compare that version of the game to the real version of Final Fantasy 15, you'll understand why that was the Switch version and the real version is not on Switch. I also think Sony just cares less about competing with the Nintendo Switch. That's like a war they really don't want to fight because it would be a lot harder to fight that war than the one that they're currently having with Microsoft and Xbox. Xbox is just buying studios to own under their umbrella, and that's kind of brute forcing people to kind of want an Xbox. I saw that Xbox Series X sales were up quite a bit because of Starfield, and that makes a lot of sense because it's an exclusive Bethesda Game Studios RPG over on the Xbox side of the fence. This video is sponsored by Ipsos iSay. If you're not familiar, Ipsos is a nearly 5 decades old research company, and Ipsos iSay is just a super simple way to voluntarily participate in research surveys. And when you take these surveys, you earn points that you can spend on gift cards. I've got my eye on a Visa gift card so I can download Armored Core 6 off the PlayStation Store. But there are a ton of other options you can take advantage of like Amazon, Target, and Walmart. The surveys are really transparent about how the data is used, and it's really easy to go through a couple when you've got some downtime like I do when I'm exporting a video. So when you're ready to try Ipsos iSay, click the link in the description to start earning rewards today. Huge shout out to Ipsos iSay for sponsoring this video. And I feel like Sony doesn't worry about Nintendo as much because A, their market share is absolutely insane and Sony can't really fight that, but B, they have the attention captured of the hardcore game. Like if I go to Target tomorrow to pick up a copy of Final Fantasy VII Remake, as cool as it is to play that game on a handheld because it does run pretty well on the Steam Deck, I would probably buy it on the PlayStation 5 just because A, it's cheaper, you don't get that Switch tax, B, it's going to look better, it's going to run at a higher resolution and higher settings and 60 FPS, and C, I don't want to play a cinematic like high production value remake like that primarily on the Nintendo Switch. The only reason I like having it on the Steam Deck is because when you have a game on Steam, you can play it on your main gaming PC and then take it on the go, which is what I'm doing with Starfield right now. I'm playing it on my main PC, but I'm also playing it in bed on the ROG Ally, and that situation is awesome. As for how the Nintendo Switch 2 being a handheld could have PS5 level performance, here are the caveats they would have to get there. So if you take the Series X, the Series S, the PS5, and the Steam Deck, the similarity between all of them is that they use an AMD chip, whereas the Nintendo Switch uses an NVIDIA chip. And if all things are to be believed that have been coming out, the Nintendo Switch 2 will also be using an NVIDIA chip. Now, why does that matter? Because of upscaling. So every game we play these days, instead of optimizing the game to run well on the hardware that's available now, a lot of developers are relying on crutches like FSR and DLSS, which basically use AI to run the game at a lower resolution and then upscale it to whatever resolution your monitor is. And it's about to get a lot better with FSR 3, but back when it came out, it was not great. And ironically, Ironically, Baldur's Gate 3 uses FSR 1.0, and you can really see how far upscaling has come with AMD. But DLSS has always been better in both looks and performance gains, and it's gotten to the point where in a lot of games, instead of using anti-aliasing, using DLSS actually makes the game look better at native resolution. So it's kind of crazy. But the killer feature of DLSS is frame generation. So if you have a 40 series card, you can use frame generation, and basically what it does is it uses an AI algorithm to scan the game you're playing, and it'll literally insert frames so fast that it'll keep the game running at a perfectly locked 60 frames per second. Starfield is the newest example of a game that doesn't have DLSS 3, but it was super easy to mod into the game, and it doubles your frame rate. It takes you from anywhere from like 50 all the way up to 120, 130 FPS, and while you do get a little bit of artifacting and stuff, you can tweak it to the point where it's barely noticeable, and the performance gains you get out of that make the trade-off worth it. So if the Switch 2 is going to include an NVIDIA chip that's like the latest technology, it stands to reason that they'd be able to at least use DLSS 2.0, but hopefully DLSS 3.0. It sucks that that's become the norm, where developers are like, well, you have DLSS, you should just use that, but it is the norm now, and we're seeing stuff like FSR in PS5 games all the time, like Jedi Survivor, for example, or Starfield on the Xbox Series X, which also uses FSR. And the reason you don't see DLSS on the PS5 is because it's not software based, it's hardware based. It's like using an actual chip on your graphics card, so it only works with NVIDIA cards. AMD's FSR works on everything, so even if this console, the Nintendo Switch 2, does support DLSS when it comes out, it'll also support FSR, which is great because upscaling is going to work on that console, and that's how you're going to get PS5 level graphics. Now, when it's docked, I don't think it's going to be running anything above 1080p, even with upscaling. The tech's just not there. Like, the Steam Deck has an extremely strong chip in it, and running games on a 1080p or even 4K TV really pushes that thing to its absolute limits, even with games like Dead Cells. So the idea of Nintendo pushing technological specs to the limit doesn't really make a lot of sense, because they really like making things affordable, and putting 1440p capable chip inside your Switch is not going to make it affordable. But if you look at the Steam Deck, it's $400. It's got an RDNA 2 chip in it, and Nintendo probably would be more prepared to take a loss on the Switch than Valve is with the Steam Deck, just because Nintendo makes their own games. Valve has the benefit of Steam, where they get 30% of every game that's sold, but they don't make a lot of games anymore. Nintendo, on the other hand, has their own first-party games, and that's basically the main thing people buy on the Switch, and they make 100% profit on those, so they can take a bigger loss on the Switch 2 with the power of the Steam Deck. So I would still expect it to be around $300, $350. So yeah, I wouldn't buy into this hype that you're going to get a portable PS5 out of the Switch. I just don't see that happening. But could it run PS5 games? I think 100% yes, especially because we're already 2.5 years into the generation. It's coming out at around the same time that it did the last generation, and that's why it was so capable of running PS4 games. Also, I don't think Sony really cares, because if I go to the store to pick up a copy of Final Fantasy VII Remake and I see it on Switch and I see it on the PS5, I'm just going to go for the PS5 version. It'll be cheaper, I know it'll look the best, it'll have the highest frame rate, and it's a cinematic game. I don't really need to take it on the go with a handheld. Alright, next up here we got to talk about this situation where Sony is raising the price of PlayStation Plus across the board. On September 6th, unless you have a bunch of stacked up PS Plus, your price is going up by up to $40 a year, which is absolutely crazy. Now, ironically, the lower the tier, the more justified it is, I think. They haven't done a price increase in a long time on PlayStation Plus. Obviously, inflation is going crazy right now, so they kind of got to adjust to make sure they're making a profit, and they have done a really good job with PS Plus Essential over the past couple years or so, except for this month where we're getting Saints Row, which is like one of the worst games that was released this generation. When you move up into the extra tier though, I don't really understand it as much. I'm not as forgiving, because a lot of the games included in the extra library have been out on the PlayStation 5 forever, and when you're talking about hardcore PlayStation fans, they're the ones that show up to buy these games day one. They're the ones who played Horizon Forbidden West, they're the ones who played Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, so adding those games to the library doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And then with Premium, they're charging more for features that don't even work. The emulation of PS1 games is terrible on the PS5. PS2 emulation is also pretty bad. They don't add enough classic games to the roster compared to what they add to extra. The streaming is terrible. You already have remote play for free no matter what. It just doesn't really make sense to buy PlayStation Plus Premium, so raising the price instead of lowering it, which is what they realistically should be doing with PS Plus Premium, just makes virtually zero sense. But just like with the console price increase that happened around the world recently with the PlayStation 5, it really seems like people don't care all that much about the price increase with PS Plus, because Sony's stock price soared over the weekend, and that creates a really crappy situation, because back in the day when Sony would make moves like this with the PS3, it would really hurt them, right? Like, the PS3 came out, it was way too expensive, it had a bunch of features people didn't want, and Sony paid the price for it. They had to take features out, they lowered the price, but the reason people didn't want the PS3 is because it didn't have a great launch lineup. Whereas the PS5 didn't really have an amazing launch lineup, but it had a good one, and since the PS5 has come out, while the output has been pretty slow, the games that have been coming out from Sony have been virtually amazing across the board, so you can see why the PS5 is still selling better, because Sony has great exclusives this time around. They're also running a victory lap with the PlayStation 4, which was basically the best console ever in terms of third-party and first-party support, and this year alone, it's just been banger after banger when it comes to game releases. So it's just like microtransactions, right? Like, people can complain about them all day long, they can say that they ruin games, and that's something that I wholeheartedly believe, but at the end of the day, people are buying them, so developers are putting them in games. That's why games like Destiny 2 and Diablo 4 have a whole dedicated team to making cosmetics, because people buy these things in the store, and even with Call of Duty, they're paying up to $25 or $30 for skin packs that are going to go away after that game's life cycle ends. I was listening to Sacred Symbols over the weekend, and Colin made a good point on that podcast that the increase from $60 to $70 of games probably wasn't enough. And Sony was looking at a really tough choice where they said, well, we could increase the price of games to $80 and probably get a ton of backlash, or we could increase the price of PlayStation Plus, which we haven't done to meet inflation, and we probably get a little backlash, but not nearly as much as if we increase the price of games to $80. So the increase of price of PS Plus is subsidizing the price of games, maybe theoretically. I think that's a good theory, and it's like a pro Sony theory, and I don't want to pretend they're doing anything bad, but it just really sucks to see prices go up at pretty much the worst time ever. I stacked a couple years of PS Plus Extra, but I gotta be honest, I haven't really used that library for the reason I just mentioned, which is I am a hardcore PlayStation gamer, so I have a ton of the games that are in that library already. So when my PS Plus Extra expires, I'm probably just gonna knock my tier down to Essential and just keep stacking those games every month, because I just feel like overall the experience I've gotten there has been a lot better. But I'm wondering, are you worried about this price increase, or do you not really care? Are you happy to pay for this service? Because with Extra and Essential at least, it's been pretty good. Let me know down in the comments below. And the third news story I have for you guys today has to do with Sony making a positive move with the PlayStation 5, which is nice to say, right? I feel like it's been pretty doom and gloom lately, but this is actually cool. So Sony, it seems, has realized that if they keep supporting the console and keep adding features people want, the console will continue to sell better and people will buy more games. And if you look at the PS5 versus the PS3 and PS4, they added features to the PS4 and PS3 over time, but I don't think it was anywhere near the level that we've gotten with the PlayStation 5. They added in the feature that allows you to upgrade the SSD in the console, and they even made that better by allowing up to 8 terabytes. They also added in 1440p resolution support, which, to be fair, both of those are things that should have been there at launch, but it was still nice to see them get supported. They've added in features like Dolby Vision, it's getting Dolby Atmos support with this new update. Like, the list goes on of features that they've added, and they really only have a couple left, like a web browser and getting themes on the console. And thankfully, it seems like Sony has realized this is helping, so we will be getting more features on the PlayStation 5 as time goes on. I love stuff like this because as time has gone on and consoles have had less and less graphical and scale leaps with each generation, like the difference between the PS2 and the PS3 is absolutely insane compared to the difference between the PS4 and the PS5. You know, it's not really that big of a graphical leap. The one way that they've been able to justify people going out and buying new consoles is to have more features. Like, you get apps like Netflix and HBO Max, you can use it as a media center. You also get new features like 3D audio and Dolby Atmos. They have their PlayStation Link feature coming that's going to have latency-free audio from your console to your headset, which is pretty cool. They're making accessories like the PlayStation Portal, which, as annoying as that thing is, some people are really going to want it, and I've seen people pre-ordering it on Twitter, which is good. They also have stuff like the PSVR 2, and it just renews their focus on the one console, right? I think that's smart. It's what Nintendo did with the Switch, and now Sony's kind of doing it with the PS5. Instead of making a handheld that competes with the PS5 by making games that should be on PS5 because you want console quality gaming on the go, everything is on the PlayStation 5, and the handheld they're coming out with is going to just play PlayStation 5 games. It makes sense just because everything is getting so consolidated with studios and publishers being bought up by Microsoft and Sony. Nintendo's even doing their own little buying spree behind the scenes, so everything has to be focused on one console. But the cool thing is, when you're focusing on just one console, it breeds innovation around that device instead of breeding innovation around new devices like the PSP or the PS Vita. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.